So, all right, a few weeks in now, you guys, if you've been tracking with us, you know the drill. Money in church comes with baggage, right? There's the God doesn't want you to have any money baggage. There's the you have money and the church wants more of it baggage. There's the God wants you to be rich beyond your wildest dreams baggage, right? We all kind of carry different sort of baggage into this topic. And so each week as we've begun this series, we just want to take a moment to take our baggage and just sit it down, right? Because our hope is that over the course of this conversation, we can hear from the Lord fresh and anew, that we can learn some things that we might be blinded to because of the baggage that we carry. And so as we work our way through this conversation, some of the baggage that you might carry about money in general, not necessarily about money in church, is what we might call buyer's remorse. You ever had that happen to you where you buy something and then very quickly the joy and the pleasure that you got from buying it fades and you start to go, I kind of wish I just had the money I spent on it instead. I remember several years ago when our kids were a bit younger, we just had a round of birthdays hit our house. And so they all had a little money in their pocket. And if you've ever gone to the store with a kid who has money in their pocket, you know where this story is going, right? We were making our rounds through the different errands we had to run that day, and one of my children, who will remain nameless to protect both the innocent and the guilty, found the thing they had to have the first place we went, right? Like the exact thing they wanted. But this child had a bit of a conundrum because to get said thing would require them to spend all of their money. And they didn't really love the idea of going home broke. Right? Nobody really does. But especially at 6 or 7 years old, you don't like the concept of I have money and now it's gone. And so they decided to wait and see. Perhaps they could find it at another store cheaper. Perhaps they might find something else to get that day. And so we made our way throughout our errands of the day, and we're at the last stop. We're in a Kohl's store, right? And so if you've ever been to Kohl's, they have that little tiny toy department at the back, right? And so by this point in the trip, all the other siblings had found something that they just couldn't live without and had either purchased it or had it ready to purchase at said Kohl's. You tracking with me? Okay? Except for this child. And suddenly, the thought of going home empty-handed seemed like a worse fate than going home broke. And so they were intent, scouring through that tiny little toy section for something to get. And there were tears. They weren't mine, but there were some tears. And we had some hard conversation about why don't you just hold on to your money and get what you really want? Like, we're never not going back to Walmart, right? It's like you'll have the opportunity to get what you really want another time. And so there in Kohl's tiny little toy department, we had a conversation about buyer's remorse in terms that a 6 or 7-year-old could understand. And we left the store with their money in their pocket and tears still rolling down their cheeks. And I hope that they learned a little something. Because wrapped up in that scene is the third idea in Money 101, the third idea of moving toward generosity. And we'll call today Desire 101. Right, because you could see in that moment in Kohl's the result of kind of our culture that's very consumer-driven. I see it, I want it, and I want it now. Right? Like that's kind of the world in which we live, the way in which we operate. If I see something and I want it, I should be able to have it now. Nothing should stand in the way. And so that creates this idea for us that I see and so I want, and then I buy, without always having a thought about the implications of that past this moment. Right? Our culture tries to convince us it's normal for our desires to be defined right now in this moment and for us to pursue those at whatever cost. And yet, throughout this conversation, we've been looking at this pathway that the Apostle Paul lays out for his young protege, Timothy. Paul's this church planner, missionary of the early church, and he writes letters back and forth to the churches. Many of them make their way into the New Testament. One of those is to a young man named Timothy. And as Paul is writing to Timothy, he's been outlining what we've called a pathway to monetary maturity. Right? And we began where Paul began, with the concept of stewardship. Stewardship 101. And if you were with us for the start of this series, you might remember that stewardship says this: you own nothing. The earth is the Lord's and all that is in it. Whatever you think you have ultimately is from God. And so the principle of stewardship says you own nothing. If you've got it, there was a moment you got it. Right? Whatever you have, there was a moment you didn't have it, and then you now have it. Right? If you have it, there's a moment that you have. If you've got it, there's a moment that you got it. And so we began then to build on that foundation and to take a look at the next concept that Paul talks about, which is contentment 101. Right? Paul lays out, he says, there are people who think that godliness is a way to get rich, right? If I do the right things, I say the right things, I behave in the right manner, then God's going to bless me and I'll get rich. So there are people who see godliness as a means to financial gain. But, he tells Timothy, godliness with contentment is great gain. And so last week, as we got further into this pathway, we saw that contentment invites us to begin defining what is enough. Because if we don't define what is enough, we will always chase more and more. Right? We will find ourselves wanting to squeeze out just a little more. I have to tell on myself because, right, we can be honest here. Can we do that? Can I be really honest with you? Recent months, I've begun doing some buying and selling on eBay, right? And so I had an item listed. And last week, we just had this whole conversation about contentment and defining enough, right? And I had several offers on the thing, and I was trying to, hit a certain point. And I got an offer that came close. And I'm sitting there in my own internal monologue debating, man, should I take this or should I wait? And this is what thought rolled through my head. I should probably accept it, but I'd really like to get just a little more. Not 48 hours after we've had the conversation that greed tells us the answer to what is enough is just a little more. And so I took my whooping from the Lord and said, okay, fine, accept. Because ultimately contentment is about defining for ourselves what is enough so that we don't perpetually chase more. So that's the pathway we've been walking thus far. But the thing that makes both stewardship and contentment difficult is desire. It's hard for us to be content when we see things that we want. It's hard for us to recognize that everything is God's when we're driven by our own selves and by our culture saying you should get whatever you want. You deserve more, right? And so at the heart of what makes these things difficult is this idea of desire, because we see it and we desire it. Now let's be clear. Desire in and of itself is not sinful. It's like money. We talked about the first week. Money is just neutral. It's just there. Our desires are part of how God has wired us, how He has created us to be. And so desire itself is not inherently sinful. The trouble is, like every good gift that God has given us, sin has a way of twisting and manipulating those good gifts from God. It does the same thing with our desires. And so desire isn't in itself sinful. It's not wrong to see something and say, I would like to get one of those. Okay, that in and of itself is not a problem. Now, within limits, right? Okay, this is a disclaimer hopefully we shouldn't have to make, but let's make it just so that we're all on the same page. Your desires can't contradict the righteousness of God, right? You can't look at someone else's spouse and desire them and that be okay, right? Jesus says some pretty strong things about that. But desire in and of itself isn't a problem if it doesn't come at the expense of our righteousness and our commitment to God. It's not wrong for us to see something and say, hey, I'd like one of those. The problem happens when getting one of those becomes our consuming focus. Do you see the difference? When we begin to fixate on the things that we desire. Paul talks about it to Timothy like this. If you invite you to turn with me in your Bibles, 1 Timothy chapter 6 again. If you follow along in the YouVersion Bible app, you can click on the Events tab and everything on the screen will be there for you. You can jot some things down, take some notes. But here in 1 Timothy chapter 6, Paul gets at this idea of desire that we want to look at today when he says this, starting in verse 9. People who want to get rich fall into temptation and a trap, and into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge men into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil, and some people, eager for money, have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. Desire, when it becomes unchecked in us, is this thing that pierces us with many griefs. Which doesn't sound all that desirable, does it, right? It sounds like this should be an easy thing for us to avoid. We don't want to be pierced with many griefs. So if it seems like it should be an easy trap to avoid, how is it that we find ourselves so often caught in that snare of seeing and desiring and wanting it now? How do we fall into that trap if we can see where it leads and it's not someplace desirable? This is where we get back to this idea that our desires are the result of our appetites that God has given us, that God has created us with certain appetites, but that those God-given appetites have been corrupted by sin. And so sin takes our appetites, twists them, and begins to project on them that they are the cure to everything. Right? Whatever it is that we desire, sin will take that desire and manipulate it so that it becomes the answer to all of our ails, all the things that are bothering us. And so as a result, we begin to chase money. We begin to chase stuff. We begin to chase relationships. We begin to chase sex. Because ultimately, the desires that God has given us have been twisted and manipulated by sin. And we find ourselves ensnared with desire. So let's move this into the realm of finances for a minute. If that's what the conversation is about. In the realm of finances, desire is often what lands us in debt. Right? Desire is often what destroys our sense of any kind of financial priorities and begins to project stuff as the answer to everything. And we know this is an actual thing that happens because our culture has a name for it. It's called retail therapy. Right? Have you ever heard someone explain it that way? Man, had a really rough week, got to hit the mall, need a little retail therapy. That's a product of a culture of desire that says, man, if I just get a little more stuff, it'll smooth out some of those feelings, some of those desires. Here's why that's a problem. This is the big idea we want to wrestle through today. Again, it's there in YouVersion. If you want to jot some things down, take some notes. Desire sells you things you don't need in the guise of a dream you can't afford. The reason that desire becomes a snare and a trap to us, even though we can see where that road leads, piercing with many griefs, is because desire tries to sell you things you don't need in the guise of a dream you can't afford. Right? We can probably all relate to that. There are probably instances in our lives that immediately spring to mind. My guess is we've all bought things and then regretted it because we didn't want it as much as we thought. But my sense is few of us have probably seen it on the scale that it shows up in the life of a man we meet in the Old Testament. We'll look together at this text, Ecclesiastes chapter 2. Throughout this series, we're kind of anchoring in 1 Timothy 6, but then taking these ideas and tracing them throughout the rest of Scripture. And so today, to talk about desire, we need to look at Ecclesiastes chapter 2, starting in verse number 1, where we read this. I thought in my heart, come now, I will test you with pleasure to find out what is good. But that also proved to be meaningless. Laughter, I said, is foolish. And what does pleasure accomplish? I tried cheering myself with wine and embracing folly, my mind still guiding me with wisdom. I wanted to see what was worthwhile for men to do under heaven during the few days of their lives. Verse 4, I undertook great projects. I built houses for myself and planted vineyards. I made gardens and parks and planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. I made reservoirs to water groves of flourishing trees. I bought male and female slaves and had other slaves who were born into my house. I also owned more herds and flocks than anyone in Jerusalem before me. I amassed silver and gold for myself and the treasure of kings and provinces. I acquired men and women singers and a harem as well, the delights of the heart of man. I became greater by far than anyone in Jerusalem before me. In all this, my wisdom stayed with me. I denied myself nothing that my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. My heart took delight in all my work. This was the reward for all my labor. Yet when I surveyed all that my hands had done and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Nothing was gained under the sun. The book of Ecclesiastes is written to us, at least from the perspective, if not from the pen, of King Solomon. If you're not familiar with Solomon, he's the son of Israel's great King David. And early in Solomon's reign, the Lord appeared to him in a dream and said, Solomon, I will grant you anything you ask from me. Right? It's like the ultimate blank check. And Solomon, to his credit in that moment, says, Lord, what I want more than anything is for the wisdom to rule your people well. And so because of his response, the Lord tells him, not only will he grant him this wisdom, but he will grant him riches beyond his wildest imaginations. And the history of Solomon's reign proves that to be true. His wisdom was renowned throughout the ancient world, stretching well beyond the borders of his kingdom. His tenure as king was marked by great wealth, great income for the people of Israel. It was a bit of a golden age of peace and prosperity. His father had been a man of war. David's time as king was filled with lingering battles and conquests against all of Israel's enemies. But Solomon's reign, we're told, the Lord gave them a time of peace. And so Solomon leans in to all that is available to him. The Old Testament tells us of Solomon that despite this time of peace and prosperity, his heart began to drift from the worship of the one true God. And Solomon married many foreign wives who introduced many foreign gods to the people of Israel. And in time, Solomon's heart itself began to drift. And so the book of Ecclesiastes is written to give us a perspective of Solomon as an older man, a man who has had it all. And the overwhelming message of the book reads very much like the passage we just read together. He concludes that life is meaningless apart from the pursuit of God's purposes. Right? Solomon had seen wisdom. Solomon had seen wealth. He had seen extravagance. And as he nears the end of his life, he says all of those things are meaningless, chasing after the wind. It's an incredible picture if you think about it. Chasing after the wind. You will never catch it. He says, wealth, extravagance, my wisdom, all the things that have been afforded me, it's all meaningless. Here in chapter 2, Ecclesiastes leans into the idea of satisfying our desires with wealth. He talks of the splendor of his kingdom. I built houses and palaces for myself. I planted gardens and vineyards. Now, to us, that's like, okay, great, you planted a garden. I've got a garden out back, right? Whatever. In the arid climate of the ancient Near East, to have enclosed gardens was a sign of great wealth and prosperity. Because, as Ecclesiastes says, you have to build reservoirs of water to keep it green and lush all the time. And gardens throughout the ancient Near East were signs of wealth and luxury. Add to that wealth was measured by the scope of your household, how many flocks and herds and sheep and donkeys and servants you had under your rule. And Solomon says, in all of those regards, my wealth is unrivaled. From the outside looking in, Solomon seems to have it all. And if he doesn't have it all, whatever he desires, he has the means to obtain it. And yet his conclusion is that he finds no satisfaction in that life. And on the surface, it seems that he has done what most of us would say we would like, right? We might not want to be rich. Because as we saw a couple weeks ago, rich is always somebody else. It's a moving target. Right? So we might not want to be rich, but we would be okay if we just could afford the things that we want. We convince ourselves that if we just had the financial freedom to get whatever we wanted, then we would be happy. And if we weren't happy, we could go and buy whatever it is that would make us happy, right? Like, there's something in us that says, yeah, I could be okay with that. I mean, I don't want to be rich. That feels dirty. But having the freedom to get what I want when I want it, yeah, sign me up for that. But what does Solomon conclude about that kind of life there in Ecclesiastes 2? I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. You hear what he's saying? Whatever I wanted, I got. I denied myself nothing. My heart took delight in all my work, and this was the reward for my labor. In other words, I earned this. I've worked hard. I've done what I need to do, and this is my right. And he says, yet, when I surveyed everything that my hands had done, what I had toiled to achieve, I realized it was meaningless. A chasing after the wind. Because desire sells you what you don't need in the guise of a dream you can't afford. And so it's always just out of reach. It's always after the next payday, after the next purchase. And so desire begins to rob us of our contentment, our ability to define enough. Desire begins to deny that everything belongs to God, that He has entrusted us with what all we need. You might remember last week we heard the story of John D. Rockefeller, who despite his lifetime wealth of $340 billion, when he was asked, Mr. Rockefeller, how much is enough? His reply came, just a little more. That is desire, twisted by the intent of sin. We begin to chase stuff, hoping it's the answer, because we've become convinced that the life we truly want is just out of reach. And if we could just get this, then we'd be happy. If I could just have that, then I would be satisfied. But for Solomon, nothing is out of reach. There's not a thing that his heart could desire that his bank account could not provide. And he concludes that all he has is meaningless. Right? He could afford the dream. But in the end, he ended up with a bunch of stuff he didn't need. Because desire is self-perpetuating. Desire has a way of building on itself, right? You're unhappy, and so we chase stuff to make us happy. And then when we get the stuff, we realize we're still unhappy, so we chase more stuff, thinking it will finally make us happy. And pretty soon you have a spiral of stuff that you just had to have that leaves you just as unsatisfied as you were to begin with. Listen in to the way the book of Ecclesiastes continues in chapter 5, starting in verse 10. It says, whoever loves money never has money enough. Whoever loves wealth is never satisfied with his income. This too is meaningless. As goods increase, so do those who consume them. And what benefit are them to the owner except to feast his eyes on them? Do you hear what Ecclesiastes is saying? If we chase stuff, we will always chase more and more stuff. The reason Paul says there to Timothy in 1 Timothy 6 that the love of money is the root of all evil goes back to what Ecclesiastes 5 says. If you love money, you will chase more money. You love money, it will never be enough. You will continually be chasing after the wind, which is backwards from what we expect, what we're told within our culture to expect. Our culture tells us you desire things, so if you get the things you desire, you'll desire less, right? Because what I wanted, I got. I'm good. But Ecclesiastes seems to say it doesn't work that way. The more you have, the more you want because you haven't defined enough. You haven't reached contentment that we touched on last time. And because our appetites are corrupted by sin, we desire and we acquire more and more only to feel just as unsatisfied as ever. Because desire sets out to sell you a dream you can't afford. To sell you what you can't afford in the guise of a dream you can't afford. So how do we fix that? Right? How do we rein that in? As followers of Jesus, if we're committing our lives to the ways and words of Jesus, how do we begin to seek change? Because it's not good enough if we can just diagnose the problem and go, yeah, we all want too much stuff. Like, that's great, we can say that, but unless we have some way to begin to adjust that, we don't really have good news to share. The way we begin to address that is to retrain our desires, to begin to exercise what we might call discipline in the way that we desire things, the way in which we chase after things. Right? If you've ever tried to go on a diet, right, and you start practicing portion control, it's incredibly difficult in the beginning, right? Because those first few days, you just wander around, and you're like, I'm so hungry. I haven't eaten in like 30 minutes, right? Because you're used to seeing and having, but you set out with discipline. You say, no. I have bigger goals. And so I'm going to practice discipline and deny myself some things that I want. And what happens in time to our physical bodies as we do that with food is we find that our appetite begins to shrink. And in time, then you begin to see the weight start to drop off. But what we have to start with is reining in the desire. The same thing happens with our financial reality. If we are constantly feeding ourselves of this idea of I want more and more and more and more, when we start to deny ourselves more and more and more and more, we're going to go, oh, this hurts, it doesn't feel good. But as we lean into the discipline of it, we'll start to see that our appetites begin to shrink because we start to recognize there's a disconnect between the things that we desire and the happiness that they bring us. So we begin to rein in those appetites that have been twisted. The more you feed your appetite for stuff, the more you desire stuff. So we have to begin to practice discipline and starve out our appetites so that we can begin to see change. Because ultimately, as we're waking our way through this pathway in 1 Timothy 6, where we want to get to is being generous people. Living generous lives. And sometimes the biggest barrier to our generosity is our own desires. Sometimes the biggest barriers to our generosity are our desires of the past that we're still paying for in the moment. So the witness that Ecclesiastes bears out for us is all the things you think are going to bring you joy and satisfaction ultimately will come up empty if you are not pursuing the things of God. Everything else under the sun is meaningless. I invite the band to come back. We're going to continue in worship here in just a moment. But I really think that desire is at the root of so much that ails us. Desire sells us this dream of all the things we have to have. It begins to convince us it's ours, which undercuts that principle of stewardship that you own nothing. It all belongs to God. It begins to rob us of our contentment as we find ourselves chasing more and more. But if we will discipline ourselves, begin to rein in our desires, our ability to make wise financial choices goes up. Our opportunities to be generous go up. So as we've done each week, let's take a moment, begin to process the things we're hearing. How are you doing in Desire 101? How would you grade yourself? And what would it take for you to move that D to a C if you're not happy with where your grade's at? What would it take to move that C to a B+? What would it take for you to get an A in reining in your desires? I promise you the answer isn't more stuff. Because whoever loves money never has enough. Whoever loves wealth is never satisfied. This, too, is meaningless. Let me pray for us.